if we are looking at the economy of South Africa, we get to see that really township and rural places, they really contribute a lot to our economy, with really agriculture and mining taking place a lot in such places. But yet at the same time, you are seeing that such spaces, they are really not advancing at all. There's still a highest level of poverty, especially in townships and also rural places. And as we know, that South Africa is the highest Gini coefficient, really with the highest inequality rates in the world, and that stems really from townships and also rural places. And already that tells you that there is something wrong really with the economy of South Africa. And at this time, we actually have Patrick Kuwana, who is the CEO and founder of Crossover Transformation Group. So Patrick has really done some incredible work in Africa and Asia, really bringing about economic transformation in such places, and he's been running quite a lot of leadership sessions in really businesses, and God has been really using Patrick in the marketplace. So Patrick, thank you really for being with us in this session. So you actually have 15 minutes to share, and what we would love you to share about is the current really economic model godly or not? How does it really affect the rural places and also the township places? So thanks a lot, Patrick. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you for the great work that you are doing, and thanks for putting all of this together. And I think just for the people who are watching, you know, I really want to commend you, Andy, for your heart and just the passion that you have to get this type of information out there. And yeah, so Andy, thank you so much for that. Okay, so I think let me try and break down what I'm going to say in a number of ways. The first thing is, I think, let me address, you know, you asked the question around, is this current economic system godly? And then I think you've also asked the question around rural township economies. So let me start off with the first one around the economy and the godliness thereof. Whenever I speak, I always try to give some definitions so that we are all on the same page in terms of those definitions, because at times we can use words in a very light manner where we assume that we know what those words actually mean. So let me start off by talking about godly. What actually is godly? Because I think we need to be very clear what godly is. So for me, the very basic definition of godly is having the same heart as God. So for us to understand what we mean by godly, we need to know what God's heart is. And therefore, somebody who says they are godly is somebody who is appreciating what's on God's heart, and therefore being a messenger and a carrier of what is on God's heart. So if we're talking about a godly economy, we therefore have to be saying it's an economy that has God's heart as its primary as its primary focus and its primary interest, its primary purpose. It's linked to God's heart. So therefore, we need to understand what God's heart is. And I think the Bible is very clear what God's heart is. God's heart is for people. God's heart is to see his Father nature known to all people, but as a father, he wants all his children to walk in inheritance, both eternal and also here on this earth. He's a God of blessing. He's a God who wants to see every single person having an abundant life where they can live in dignity, where they can live provided for, where they can have food on the table, where they can have access to good health care, where they can have access to means of production, where they can be productive, where they can feed their families, and the list can go on and on. That's where God's heart is, and therefore godly, we need to be sure we understand godliness. Let's talk about economy very, very quickly. For me, an economy is just very simplistically when we look at, first of all, the means of production, secondly, consumption, and in between, distribution. So it's basically, in effect, it's a system that says we are producing goods and services. There are people who need to consume those goods and services, and in between, there has to be a distribution system that gets those goods and services to those people, and there's trade that's involved, exchange of money, exchange of value, so that everyone in the system hopefully walks away with the true value of what they need to walk away with, but also everyone is valued based on what they bring to the system. And if we're talking about an economic system that's godly, then it also then means that system is valuing people correctly based on what they're bringing, and it's also rewarding them based on what they're bringing to the table. It's a transparent system. There's no hidden agendas in it. It's not a monopolistic system. It's a system that's there to operate in a way where everyone at the end of the day is blessed. So that for me is an economy. That for me is godliness. So to answer the question, is this economy godly? I think we can then almost begin to ask ourselves, is it really godly? If the current system, I believe, has been driven largely by a lot of greed, a lot of selfishness, a lot of pride. So when I look at the current capitalist system that we've seen emerge over time, it's largely driven by, let's run this system for the benefit of a few people who will effectively build the structures of wealth, and therefore it becomes a very monopolistic system that effectively extracts value from everyone else for the benefit of a few people. And therefore, for me, it's not a transparent system. It's a system that is effectively exploiting a lot of people without giving them the true value that they deserve. There's been a rise in the whole situation in terms of changing people's mindsets from being 100% focused on shareholders to become more focused on stakeholders, because the whole movement, the whole structure that focuses the whole economy on the interests of the shareholder basically means those who have are the ones who run the system, and the system benefits those, and those who don't literally are neither here or there. They are just there to serve the system, and the system continues to operate in a very greedful, materialistic way. So for me, all of this just points to one of the things that Jesus said very clearly, where he says, guys, you can't worship two systems. You can't worship God and you can't worship mammon at the same time. What I believe we have seen over many years is largely a mammon-driven system of the economy that has completely not focused on what's on God's heart. God's heart is for the poor. God's heart is for the orphans. God's heart is for those who are helpless, those who have been dealt with unjustly and unrighteously. That's where God's heart is. And therefore, any economic structure that wants to be godly has to start off by thinking first, not pride, but humility, not greed, but generosity, not selfishness, but selflessness. That system obviously has to take into consideration that we have to produce, we have to trade, and we have to generate a profit. So it's not saying this is a system where it's now just giving everything away. It has to generate a profit, because the profit is what makes this system sustainable. But the profit motive is not a selfish profit for me. It's a profit for how do we generate a system that begins to inclusively profit more people, so that more people can enter into the cycle of the system. Because more people that we have being productive in the system, the more the system actually grows and generates even more for everyone. So it's all a case of, is it a system that looks to benefit and build for a few, or is it a system that's designed to bring inclusivity and bring as many people into the system so that it can grow? And I believe for us here, especially in South Africa, where we are known statistically as being one of the most unequal countries. Our Gini coefficient is one of the highest in the world, which is basically a measure of the inequality economically. And therefore, I believe for us to really be known as a godly nation, in most of the talks I have, I say to people, I believe when our Gini coefficient, our level of inequality starts to come down, I believe that will be a sign that we are moving as a country to be a godly nation. Because for as long as that gap continues to grow, we cannot possibly be saying to ourselves, we are a godly nation, when the very essence of the economy is bringing more and more disparity between people. And I think the last thing I want to just mention before I shift to the rural township just for a couple of minutes is that in God's economy, there are a number of things that are important for God. First of all, people are more important than money. We must never value money more than people. Secondly, relationships are more important than transactions. We must never break relational equity because we are chasing after money. Secondly, thirdly, God's kingdom, we read in the Bible, is based on a foundation of righteousness and justice. And therefore, if we are truly running anything that we claim to be kingdom or godly, it has to be built on the foundation of righteousness and justice. And that is saying we honor people, we value people, but we also give people what is worth for them based on what they are bringing to the table. God's kingdom wants to look at the helpless and to help them. It wants to help people enter into the system so that they can also begin to generate economic wealth and economic prosperity. The second point is just talking about the rural township economy. One of my personal challenges is an economy that becomes too corporate monopolistic. Because when you look at your distribution chains, your value chains, where there are now monopolies in place, it cuts out your township economy. For me, the saddest thing, and I know this can be very controversial, the saddest thing is to see your big shopping malls coming into your townships and killing the township economy of the butcher shop, the grocery shop that was built within the township, where the money was circulating within the townships to be able to generate an economic system where the money remains inside the system rather than having big players come in, set up shopping malls, get everybody to become consumers, and all they do is they shift the money out of the township, and it goes back to the same elite again, and the township just becomes a consumption base. That has to change. That's one of the key things that we need to change in South Africa, the whole model in terms of how the rural and the township economies work. And I believe the monopolies of your distributors and your retailers kills the economy, because I believe God's economy starts off by the family unit, and out of the family unit it builds into small communities, because God's economy was never about big monopoly corporates who control value chains, who control distribution systems. It was about small units being productive and being able to trade with each other so that economic value is multiplied within communities, and those communities could go and trade with other communities, and that's how value was basically generated. So for us as South Africa, I truly believe the current model that we are running is not going to lead to economic growth unless we shift it to make our rural areas and our townships places of production, but also places where distribution can take place within the system, consumption can take place within the system, and that money can circulate within that system without being stripped out of the system and channeled to what I call the monopolistic elite. That is a critical element for me when it comes to all of this. So Andy, I think I've taken up my 15 minutes. That's enough for now.